the National Archives in London, in a record series with the unglamorous designation W0416, there are thousands of small index cards. They are not British documents. They are German ones, captured intact when Allied forces overran prisoner-of-war camps in the final weeks of the war. And they contain something the British and American armies never had reason to compile with the same obsessive precision. A bureaucratic record, kept by the enemy, of exactly who its prisoners were and exactly how much trouble each one caused. Most of those cards are unremarkable. Name, rank, camp number, date of capture, a line or two noting good behavior, or none at all. But scattered through that filing system are a small number of cards that grow thicker than the rest. Cards where a single prisoner's file expands across camp transfers, disciplinary notes, security classifications, and finally, a single administrative decision that German record keepers reserved for only the most persistent men in their custody. One of those files belongs to a New Zealand officer, and by the time the war ended, the paperwork generated by his 4 years in captivity told a story the German army itself had never intended to tell. Not a story of heroism, because that had already been decided on the battlefield before he was ever captured. This is a different story. It is the story German administrators wrote about a prisoner they simply could not keep contained. Told entirely through their own words, their own stamps, and their own growing frustration. Recorded in the flat, procedural language of an army, trying and repeatedly failing to hold on to one man. This isn't a story about a medal. You already know, if you know this soldier's name at all, that Charles Upham became one of only 3 men in history to be awarded the Victoria Cross twice, an achievement earned entirely through combat that has been told and retold for 80 years. That part of the story is finished, and this video is not going to repeat it. What almost nobody tells is what happened after the fighting stopped for him, when he became, on paper, simply another captured enemy officer that the German military bureaucracy was required to process, document, and secure. What that bureaucracy actually wrote down about him, camp by camp, form by form, is a story that has almost nothing to do with valor and everything to do with what happens when a rigid procedural system runs directly into a man it was never designed to hold. So here is the question worth sitting with before we go any further. Why would an army fighting a global war, managing hundreds of thousands of prisoners across dozens of camps, spend increasing amounts of administrative attention, security classification, and physical resources on containing one wounded infantry officer from a country most German soldiers could not have located on a map? The answer to that question is written, camp record by camp record, into files the Germans themselves compiled and never expected anyone but their own command to ever read. Before we get into exactly what those records say, if stories built directly from primary documents like this are what you come here for, this is a good moment to subscribe, because this channel exists specifically to go beneath the version of history everyone already knows and find what the paperwork actually said. To understand why the German record system began paying this kind of attention to one particular prisoner, you first have to understand what the German POW administration actually looked like by the middle years of the war, because it was, on the surface, a remarkably thorough and rule-bound machine. Every captured Allied officer was assigned an O flag, an officer's camp, tracked by a card system recording capture location, transfers, medical treatment, and any disciplinary incidents. Escape attempts were logged with specific procedural language, dates, methods, and the security response that followed. This was not chaos. It was, in its own grim way, meticulous German administration applied to the business of holding enemy officers, built on the assumption that a well-documented, well-secured system could contain almost anyone, provided the paperwork was followed and the right camp was chosen for the right prisoner. Charles Upham arrived inside that system already wounded, and already, in the German record's own early language, cooperative enough. He had been captured in July 1942 at Rueisat Ridge during the fighting around El Alamein, severely wounded and taken first to an Italian field hospital, then to a longer-term facility at Modena in northern Italy, where doctors initially recommended amputating his badly damaged arm, given the scarcity of supplies and the risk of infection. Upham refused, choosing to recover without the operation rather than lose the limb. And it was during this recovery, still confined to an Italian hospital bed, that the first entry in what would become an unusually long administrative history was made. He attempted to escape from the hospital itself, before he was even fully mobile. That single early incident should have been, in the ordinary run of German POW administration, a minor footnote. Wounded officers attempting premature, poorly planned escapes were not unusual, and most such attempts ended exactly where this one did, with recapture and a return to routine hospital custody. But it established in the German record the first line of a pattern that camp administrators over the following 2 years would return to again and again, each time with slightly more concern and slightly less patience than the last. By September 1943, having been transferred from Italy into the German camp system proper, following Italy's surrender that same month, Upham's file crossed into German hands directly, and the pattern accelerated almost immediately. In July of that year, according to the record kept by his captors, he had already made the first of what would become a long sequence of increasingly determined escape attempts, resulting in a transfer to a camp at Weinsberg, specifically because his previous location was judged inadequate to contain him. This is the exact moment where German administrative language begins to shift, from processing a captured officer to managing what the record itself would eventually call, in the flattest possible bureaucratic terms, a dangerous prisoner. Let's be honest about how strange that classification actually is, because on paper it makes very little sense applied to a single wounded infantry captain. Dangerous, in the vocabulary of a POW administration built to hold hundreds of thousands of men, was not a word reserved for officers who simply wanted, understandably, to go home. It was a specific security designation, reserved for prisoners the system had concluded could not be trusted to remain in a standard camp under standard supervision. Prisoners whose continued presence represented an active, ongoing security problem, regardless of how carefully they were watched. Upham earned that designation not through a single dramatic escape, but through a string of individually unremarkable attempts that, taken together, forced camp administrators to conclude something the record makes almost embarrassingly clear. Standard containment simply was not working on this particular man. Picture it from the perspective of the camp officers actually filling out these forms, because that is where this story becomes genuinely strange rather than simply admirable. You are a German officer responsible for the orderly administration of a prisoner of war camp holding hundreds of Allied officers, most of whom, whatever their private hopes of escape, understand the practical odds well enough to behave according to camp routine. Then there is one file that keeps returning to your desk, a wounded New Zealander who does not appear to calculate odds the way your other prisoners do. He has already tried to escape from a hospital bed. He has already tried again from his first German camp, resulting in transfer. And now, according to the escalating notes in his own file, he is going to try something almost absurd in its boldness. Climbing directly over the camp's barbed wire perimeter fences in broad daylight, in full view of the guards, rather than attempting any of the quieter, more conventional methods the system was actually built to anticipate. He became entangled in the wire between the two fence lines during that attempt, caught in the open, and according to the account preserved from prisoners who witnessed it, a guard leveled a pistol directly at him and threatened to shoot him where he hung in the wire. That should, by any reasonable administrative logic, have ended the pattern permanently. It did not. Here is the detail that turns up in the record and the surviving witness accounts together, the one that separates this file from an ordinary escape log. After the daylight fence attempt, German camp security did exactly what the paperwork suggests. A rational system should do with a prisoner it has now formally classified as dangerous. They isolated him. Solitary confinement. Exercise permitted only alone, under direct observation of two armed guards on the ground and, in a detail that reads, almost like overkill, until you understand exactly what this man had already demonstrated. A machine gun covering the exercise yard from a tower above. This was not standard treatment for a standard prisoner. This was a camp administration explicitly designing a containment protocol around the specific, documented behavior of one individual file. He escaped from that too. According to the accounts preserved by fellow prisoners who later corroborated the story, Upham simply bolted from the small courtyard during his supervised, isolated exercise period, running directly through the German barracks area and out through the camp's main gate before the guards covering him could react in time to stop him. The machine gunner in the tower, positioned specifically to prevent exactly this outcome, did not fire. Witnesses later reported that the guard explained his restraint afterward, not as a failure of duty but as something closer to reluctant respect, combined with the practical calculation that German patrols were already visible on the road ahead and likely to recapture the prisoner regardless. That explanation, whatever its exact motivation, is itself worth pausing on, because it means that even the men whose specific job was to stop this particular prisoner had, by this point in his captivity, developed something like a grudging deference toward the file they had been assigned to manage. He was recaptured within hours, and it was this incident, on top of everything logged before it, that finally produced the administrative decision German camp records had been building toward for over a year. If you're finding the paper trail on this stranger than the story you already knew, that's exactly the point of digging into a source most documentaries skip past, and it's exactly the kind of thing this channel keeps doing. So if you haven't already, this is a good point to subscribe. Before we get to what happened at the camp, Germany itself had officially declared escape-proof. On the 14th of October, 1944, the administrative record shows Upham's transfer to Oflag 4C, better known by the name of the small Saxon town beneath its walls, Colditz. This was not a randomly assigned camp. Colditz existed within the German POW system as a specific, deliberate category of its own, a Sonderlager, a special high-security facility reserved almost entirely for officers who had already escaped from other camps, or who had been formally judged through exactly the kind of documented pattern built up in Upham's own file, to represent an unmanageable security risk anywhere else in the system. Hermann Göring himself was reported to have called the castle escape-proof, a claim the German security staff assigned there took seriously enough to build an entire internal department around defeating it. The camp's own security officer, a career intelligence man named Reinhold Eggers, kept his own meticulous internal museum of confiscated escape equipment, forged documents, and improvised disguises, specifically to study and counter the ingenuity of the officers, now concentrated under his direct supervision. Over the full span of the war, Colditz's own administrative records would eventually catalogue more than 180 separate recorded escape attempts by the prisoners held inside its walls. Being sent there was not, in German administrative terms, a punishment in the ordinary sense. It was closer to an admission. It meant the standard system, built to hold hundreds of thousands of men through routine procedure and reasonable security, had formally conceded that this particular prisoner required an entirely separate category of containment, built and staffed specifically around men exactly like him. And even that transfer itself did not go according to plan. The German record of Upham's journey to Colditz includes one final entry that belongs less to a war memoir than to something closer to farce, if the stakes had not been so genuinely dangerous. Moved under guard by civilian train toward the castle, Upham was permitted to use the train's toilet only while the train was travelling at high speed, a precaution his guards had apparently learned to take specifically to prevent him from attempting exactly what he then attempted anyway. He forced open the small toilet window and jumped from the moving train onto the tracks below, knocking himself unconscious in the fall. When he woke, disoriented and injured, he made it into a nearby orchard before German search parties, aided by the simple geometry of evenly planted, undergrowth-free orchard rows that offered him almost nowhere to actually hide, recaptured him roughly 12 hours later. That is the final entry of substance in the escape pattern German records kept on this one prisoner, before Colditz's own walls finally did what every previous camp administration had failed to manage. Not because Upham stopped trying, but because Colditz itself, purpose-built and specifically staffed to counter exactly this kind of determined, resourceful prisoner, offered him almost no further opportunity. He would remain there for the final months of the war, one part of a community of officers from half a dozen allied nations that German security records themselves had effectively branded, camp by camp, as the Empire's most troublesome and persistent escape artists, until American forces finally overran the castle in April 1945, and the entire German administrative project of containing these particular men came, all at once, to an end. Here is the layer of this story almost nobody sits with, the one that turns a simple escape narrative into something genuinely revealing about the two very different kinds of record being kept throughout all of this. The German file on Upham, precise, procedural, and utterly without embellishment, never once frames any of this in heroic terms, because it was never written for that purpose. It was written by an administration trying to solve a practical containment problem, and every entry in it, the hospital escape, the Weinsberg transfer, the daylight fence climb, the dangerous classification, the solitary confinement with machine gun cover, the courtyard bolt, the train window, the final transfer to Colditz, exists purely as evidence in an internal argument the German camp system was quietly having with itself about how much resource and security a single prisoner justified. Read cold, without any context about who this man was or what he had already done on the battlefield before his capture, the file reads as an escalating, almost exasperated bureaucratic confession. Every standard method failed. Every increased precaution failed. Eventually, an entire specially designed fortress prison, built and staffed at real cost specifically to solve this exact category of problem, was required just to hold the file still. That is the story German records actually tell, and it is a different story from the one usually told about this man, because it was never meant to be inspiring. It was meant to be an internal accounting of failure, camp administrator to camp administrator, prisoner file to prisoner file. Each new entry a quiet admission that whatever had been tried before had not, in fact, worked. There is a strange kind of tribute buried inside that failure, even though tribute was the furthest thing from what the German record keepers intended. An enemy army's own paperwork, generated purely for internal security purposes, with no propaganda value and no audience beyond its own command structure, ended up documenting, in exhaustive, dispassionate procedural detail, exactly how much one determined man could cost a system built to contain hundreds of thousands. No German officer filling out those transfer forms or classification notes was trying to make Upham look remarkable. They were simply, honestly, recording what kept happening, camp after camp, until the pattern itself became undeniable, even inside the flattest bureaucratic language available to describe it. That is what makes this particular kind of record so different from every other version of this story you have likely already heard. A citation written by your own side, describing your own battlefield conduct, is always, to some degree, a document built to honor you. A file kept by your enemy, describing your repeated failure to remain contained, was built for the opposite purpose entirely: to manage a problem, to justify resources, to explain upward through a chain of command why one prisoner required a level of security ordinarily reserved for dozens. And it is precisely because that file was never meant to impress anyone that it ends up, 80 years later, telling us something the more polished, celebratory version of this story never could. Not what one man was capable of on a battlefield surrounded by witnesses on his own side, but what he was still capable of alone, wounded, unarmed, and surrounded entirely by men whose entire professional purpose was to make sure he stayed exactly where they put him. He never did. The paperwork says so, in the enemy's own hand, camp by camp, form by form, until the only honest entry left to write was the name of a castle that Germany itself had already admitted, before he ever arrived there, was the last option it had. If this is the kind of story you want more of, built straight out of the documents rather than the retelling, subscribe now, because there is a great deal more sitting in archives like this one, still waiting for someone to actually read it.